Good morning. All right, we're going to get going here. Welcome to our monthly webinar. This month's topic is incentive fees. If this is your first time joining us, let me just tell you a little bit about the format. Since we have a lot of people on these webinars, I do have everyone on mute. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, I ask that you email them to crc@pennyitworks.com. At the end, I'll take a look and see if questions have come in. If I don't get to your question on the webinar, I'll be reaching out to you later this afternoon to follow up with you. Okay, so today we're going to go over incentive fees. As you can see, under the Fees tab, we have an entire folder for incentive fees, and there's a lot of different options. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through the setup screen and explain the various options on the incentive fee setup. We're going to cover some of the additional functionality related to incentive fees, and then we're going to take a look at some of the reports specific to the incentive fees. So let's jump right in. And first we're going to take a look at a straight, easy, flat 20% reallocation fee. So the first thing you'll notice on our fee setup is the section at the top. This applies to all our fees. You have to indicate how it's taken, reallocate versus expense. Reallocate will reallocate up to the general partner. Expense will charge the fee as an expense to the fund. You have an option on withdrawals. So if you have withdrawals that are not at the charge period, what happens to that crystallized incentive fee? Does it immediately go up to the GP? Or it get expensed, or does it get put into a suspense account where it will remain until the charge date? Speaking of charge dates, here's where you enter what your charge date is. You have several options. You can do it yearly. That's probably the most common. You can also do quarterly, each period. We also have an option for never, and while this may seem strange to never charge a fee, this comes in useful for when you have side pockets that perhaps calculate a fee but don't actually charge it against the investor until they leave the side pocket. If you have this set to never, note, and we're going to go over it a little later in the webinar, there is a manual trigger that you can use to charge the fee. Loss carry forward reset. Here's where you can indicate, and you're given the choice of never resetting the loss carry forward, which is the most common option, and that's the default, or you can reset it when the incentive fee is charged. Now here I said this is an example of a flat 20%. The percent of fee should be entered into the fee percent column. And when you enter this in, you just put the number. So if it's a 20% fee, you put 20, 10% fee, you put 10. You don't have to put in 0.2 or 20%. It's just the number that gets entered. So this is a nice, easy, straightforward fee. Let's take a look at something a little more complex. This is an example of a tiered fee. Now, when you're going in and having a tiered fee, you have a couple more options you have to look at. So we're going to jump to this middle section here, specific to tiers. The first choice you have to make is your tier base. This is the base that Penny will use when calculating the tier. You have several different options. So depending on what you use as your base, I'm sure you can find the option within everything the drop-down has to offer. So I'm going to go with beginning plus changes, which is the beginning capital plus capital changes. The next choice you have to make is your first tier. What's that going to be? Your options are hurdle. This is the most common setting, and this is where the fee percentage will be applied to all P&L up to the upper boundary of the first tier. You also have guarantee. This is used when you only want to charge the fee if the P&L is equal to or greater than the tier. And you have carry forward, guarantee with carry forward. So this acts similar to the guarantee, but at the end of the charge period, if the total P&L is less than the tier's upper boundary, then that amount is added to the loss carry forward for the next period. Now, I've kind of given a quick snapshot of what these options are. I'm going to take you in to the help file. The help file for incentive fees, I know I always talk about the help file, But incentive fees is wonderful. There's so much information in here. And so, for example, here's a little section about that first tier, which is what I just went over. But if you see, there's an entire section dedicated to just the difference between guaranteed payment versus hurdle with examples. So if you go to the help file, there are lots of examples of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I highly recommend you take a look in there. Now, when you have rates, you also have the option to prorate them. So you can have the tiers prorated based upon the number of days that have gone through in the fee period. So what this does is it smooths out the fee accrual during the year rather than the fee suddenly increasing because the P&L crossed the boundary. So for example, in this case, we have an upper percent of 5. So let's say in January the fund is up 3%. Well, if you don't prorate, no fee is going to be accrued because 3% is less than the 5% tier. However, it's 3% for 1 month, so if you look across time, and this is 5% for the year, 3% in January, if you prorate it, and you can prorate, you have a variety of options on which rates to be prorated, and you have various day counts as well. So for example, 30 over 360 or actual over actual. So what this does again is smooth out the fee accrual. So now let's jump down below. The first column here, we talk about steps. This is the order that the tiers are processed. So if you have, example 2 tiers, this is your first tier, this is your second tier. Upper percent, this is the step percentage applied to the hurdle base to determine that upper boundary of the tier. So in this case, 5%. Upper rate, this allows you, if you don't have a set percentage that you're using and you're using, let's say, an index as your upper rate, what you can do is set up an interest rate in the system and then tag the hurdle to that rate. So here I have the S&P, and again, if I'm just hop into the General Ledger tab, you can set up an interest rate, and then that will allow you to choose it from the drop-down here as your upper rate. Upper factor, this is usually used with the special loss carry-forward tier. This is a multiple to be applied to the hurdle base to determine the upper boundary of a tier. So you have several different ways when you talk about that upper boundary of the tier. Fee percent, as I said before, this is the percent you're actually going to charge. So in this example, my first tier is 0% fee, and then once you get over that, it's going to charge 20%. The fee rate, this is the variable interest rate to be applied to the hurdle base, again to determine that upper boundary of the tier. Now, here's a column for tier base. And I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, we went over tier base up here. Why do we have it down here? Well, when you set the tier base up at the top, that is applied to every tier of your fee, every step, I should say. You do have the option of having different tier bases for your different levels of your fee. So if, for example, your first tier, you wanted to use a different tier base, you can select it from the drop-down. And the options here are the same as the options up here. Tier name, this is just for your own informative purposes. You can put in a note, I think it allows up to 50 characters, where you can describe the tier. And when you run the incentive fee tier report in DataGrid, there is a column for tier name where you can see your notes. And finally, we have here cumulative. You have 2 choices, absolute and cumulative. And again, I'm going to jump to the help file, because this, what the difference here is, this is what dictates whether or not that upper boundary of a prior tier should be added to the other tiers. And again, if I go into the help file, we have an entire section on just the difference between the cumulative versus absolute tiers. So you'll see when you have cumulative, it will add together your upper percent. So if your first tier is 5 and your second tier is 7, you're looking at a cumulative percentage of 12, as opposed to absolute, where your second tier you would have to put in the 12 because it's going to keep that separate. It's not going to add the 12 and the 5. So at this point, you're probably saying, wow, that's a lot of options. We actually have even more. We have a separate tab called Additional Options. Now, this is where you're really fine-tuning your incentive fee calculation. In many cases, what we have as the default is what most people use, which is why we have it on a separate tab. But just to show you the flexibility we have, let's go through these options as well. So we have the loss carry forward adjust capital base. Now, in most cases, this is current. What this setting does is determines the calculation method used for the loss carry forward adjustment. So you do have, again, multiple options. Here, this checkbox here, this is an addition. This option allows you to use the same methodology that is used to determine the amount of the accrued fees to charge for a withdrawal. You also have currency. Our incentive fees are multi-currency. So this is where you can tell the system to calculate the incentive fee based upon a currency other than the base of the fund. And again, these currencies are set up under the General Ledger tab under currencies. So whatever currencies you have set up here and then you value through the setup of the General Ledger tab, it will apply here. We have management fee. We're going to get into a little later about the ability to exclude P&L from the incentive fee calc. Management fee came up a lot, so we have it as an option. Most people have it as include, but you do have the ability on the incentive fee setup to exclude management fee from the calculation. You also have rate options. What this option does is controls the value used for variable interest rates. So with this field, you can determine whether the fee calculation uses an average interest rate for the period or takes the latest interest rate, known as the spot rate. And again, it normally will default to spot. And down here, finally, we have a box, overperform setting. What the overperform setting does is this is used when the fee is based on a fund's performance against a particular benchmark. And again, when you talk about benchmarks, we're talking about, on the General Ledger tab here, the interest rates you have set up. So rather than the fund's profit and loss, it's actually going to compare against this index. So for example, if the fund is down 5%, but the index was down 7%, then you'll actually take incentive fee on the 2%, since the fund outperformed the index. We also have, if you notice here, calculated at feeder. This relates to master feeder structures where the feeder fund performs the calculation of the incentive fee that is ultimately reallocated and charged at the master. So this type of fee, we can accommodate it as well by checking the calculated at feeder box. And then there's finally like a third tab where you can indicate what that feeder information is. So that pretty much covers all of your settings on incentive fees. As you can see, we have tremendous flexibility. I think the most important thing when setting up the incentive fee is to really understand what all the components are for your fee. We always suggest taking a look at some sample data or even creating it and just putting an example together. If an investor has $100 and they're up, 5%, what is the fee going to do? If there's a withdrawal, what does it do? If there's additional contributions, how is it handled? So that you can really test out your fee setup. I mentioned some additional functionality. As with most fees in the system, we do allow the ability to override. So when you're looking at incentive fees, we do have the option for both partners and share-based. So we have incentive fee overrides for partners. And to just take a quick look, this gives you the ability to override your fee, put in an adjustment, override the charge, Also to override or populate your loss carry forward either at the end of the period or the beginning, and to adjust your accrual. So there's tremendous flexibility in being able to override your fees in the system. And again, we have two separate overrides. This is for partnerships, and we also have one specific to share-based funds. We also have an incentive fee tiered override, which allows you to override some of the information on the tiers, such as the hurdle base. We have an incentive fee exclude. I mentioned this earlier, with management fees, you can set that up on the incentive fee itself, but let's say you have a section of P&L that you just don't want the incentive fee applied to. What you can do is put in an incentive fee exclude where you indicate your fund. You can do it period specific, or you can leave the period blank and it'll apply to every period. And then you just choose your account and sub-account where you'll book your P&L that you don't want included in the incentive fee. And then finally, we have incentive fee charge date. And this I had mentioned previously. If you have a side pocket where the fund is, the charge date is set to never, here is where you can indicate the fund, indicate the charge date, and it will manually charge the fee. From a reporting point of view, I want to take you to the incentive fee calc report. This is our basic incentive fee report. This presents the detail behind the calculation of the accrual, the loss carry forward, anything in suspense, anything charged for all the non-GP investors. It does commingle partners and shareholders, and it groups by the investors by their investor role. You can also see I talked about all those overrides. If something is overridden, there will be an X next to the number to indicate that an override was used. For more detail, we have the incentive fee tier report. So this report is used for tiered fees, and it will actually break down each tier. It presents the hurdle rate calculations, any clawback, and P&L calculations. It shows what the capital bases are used in the calculation, as well as any adjustments for prior and current P&L. So if you have a tiered fee, I would suggest that you use the incentive fee tier report as opposed to the incentive fee calc report, because it gives you that additional information. We have a report specific to the GPs, which is called the incentive fee GP report. And this shows the incentive fee amount charged, either allocated to the GP or expensed, and it shows it by layers by period. We also have the incentive fee subject to fee. And this one comes in handy. This one will show you, this is an audit report that shows the components that make up that income subject to fees. And it can be used to tie the income back to the various reports in the system. And it's especially helpful if you had any excluded P&L. And finally, we have the incentive fee audit report. Now, this report can be run several different ways. So under report type, you'll see we have a lot of, and these reports tend to get very specific. So I talked about the overperform incentive fee. We have a report specific to the overperform adjustment. So with all these different variations, I would highly suggest, play around with them. For example, the summary adjustment, this rolls up all the incentive fee adjustments by investor. Transaction adjustment, this one displays the adjustment by each transaction that caused the adjustment. And we're talking about withdrawals and capital transactions. We have a hurdle base report, which presents the detail of the calculation of certain hurdle bases. So as you can see, the incentive fee, there is a lot going on. Hopefully, you can see there's tremendous reporting capabilities, tremendous flexibility. With the reporting, we really try to provide all the components that go into the calculation so that if you ever question the fee, that you can drill down and see where all the figures are coming from. And of course, with incentive fees, if you ever have a new incentive fee you're setting up in the system, feel free to reach out to your CRM if you need to double check to make sure you're setting things up correctly. So at this time, I'm just going to take a quick look and see if any questions have come in. Okay, I don't see any questions for this session, but of course, if you do, I ask that you contact us, reach out to our help desk at crc@pennyatworks.com. Thank you for joining us. We will have another webinar next month, so please join us on Thursday, November 20th, where we will be covering management fees. Thank you. Have a nice day.